On the morning of February 18th, 2001, a 56-year-old FBI agent named Robert Philip Hanssen drove to Foxstone Park in Vienna, Virginia, a quiet suburban nature preserve a few miles from his home, parked his car, walked to a wooden footbridge over a small stream, and placed a package of classified documents under the bridge for collection by a Russian intelligence operative he had never met and whose name he did not know. He had been doing this, or something very like it, for 22 years. He had done it under 3 American presidents and 4 FBI directors. He had done it while his wife attended daily mass at their local Catholic church, and while his children grew up and moved out, and while his colleagues at the FBI promoted him and trusted him and gave him access to the most sensitive counterintelligence programs the Bureau ran. He had done it while the FBI was actively hunting the mole whose damage he was causing, running a mole investigation that, at one point, assigned him to help conduct it, placing the man responsible for the damage in charge of assessing the damage, an institutional failure so complete and so emblematic of the specific pathologies of the FBI's counterintelligence culture that it reads, in retrospect, less like an oversight than like the logical conclusion of a system that had organized itself around trusting its own people in a way that made it almost impossible to suspect them. He had sold the names of 3 Soviet officers who had been recruited by American intelligence and who were subsequently executed by the Soviet Union because of what he told their handlers. He had revealed the existence of a secret tunnel the United States had dug under the Soviet embassy in Washington to eavesdrop on communications. He had identified intelligence sources and methods across a range of programs. He had passed thousands of pages of classified documents and computer diskettes to Soviet and then Russian intelligence over 2 decades, receiving in return approximately $1.5 million in cash and diamonds, money he used partly for family expenses and partly to fund a private school education for his children at the Oakcrest School in McLean, Virginia, a Catholic school whose tuition he could not otherwise have afforded on an FBI salary. He was caught not because the FBI figured it out, and not because a colleague noticed something, and not because the counterintelligence system he had spent 20 years compromising detected the compromise. He was caught because a Russian intelligence officer who had access to his file sold that file to the CIA for $7 million, and the file contained, among other things, a garbage bag with Hanssen's fingerprints on it. And that was enough. 22 years, 3 executions, billions of dollars of damage to American national security, caught by a paid informant from the other side. This is the story of Robert Hanssen, of what he did and why he did it, and what it cost and what it revealed about the institution that employed him and trusted him, and failed to catch him for longer than some of his victims had been alive. Robert Philip Hanssen was born in Chicago in April 1944, the only child of a Chicago police officer named Howard Hanssen, a man whom the psychological and biographical literature on the Hanssen case describes with a consistency that suggests genuine explanatory weight as cold, demanding, contemptuous, and given to systematic humiliation of his son in ways that ranged from the casually cruel to the deliberately demeaning. Howard Hanssen told his son he was not smart enough to be a doctor. He gave Robert an IQ test and then told him the results were not as good as Robert had thought they would be, whether or not this was true. He told his son he was not cut out for police work, the career he himself had built his identity around. The psychological literature on the formation of people who betray institutions they belong to tends, unsurprisingly, to emphasize early experiences of rejection and contempt from authority figures, and Robert Hanssen's relationship with his father provides the kind of clinical material that makes this literature almost too neat, almost too explanatorily convenient. And yet the pattern is real, and it manifests throughout Hanssen's life in ways that are difficult to attribute to coincidence. He spent his career at the FBI demonstrating to an audience of one, himself, or the ghost of the father who had told him he was not good enough, that he was in fact the smartest person in the room, smarter than his supervisors, smarter than his colleagues, smarter than the Soviet intelligence services he was betraying his country to, smarter than the counterintelligence investigators who were looking for him without finding him. He was, in fact, extremely intelligent. His IQ has been estimated in the genius range by the psychologists who evaluated him after his arrest. He had a degree in chemistry from Knox College, a dental school education he did not complete, an accounting degree, and a law degree from Northwestern, and he had taught himself computer systems well enough to be one of the Bureau's early technology specialists at a time when computer literacy in federal law enforcement was rare and valued. He joined the FBI in 1976 after a stint with the Chicago Police Department that lasted 3 years and that he apparently found intellectually beneath him. And he was from the beginning of his FBI career a man whose abilities were visible to his supervisors and whose interpersonal skills were not. He was arrogant. He was dismissive of colleagues he considered less capable, which was most of them. He was given to pronouncements about the Bureau's inadequacies that made him unpopular with supervisors who did not enjoy being told their programs were poorly designed by a relatively junior agent. He was also, from the beginning of his FBI career, a devout Catholic of a specific and demanding variety, a member of Opus Dei, the conservative Catholic organization whose practices include corporal mortification and whose members are expected to integrate their faith comprehensively into their professional and personal lives. He attended daily Mass. He said the Rosary. He went to confession regularly. He taught Sunday school. He was, by every external account, a man of profound and genuine religious conviction, and he was simultaneously, from 1979 onward, a man who was providing the Soviet Union with intelligence that would cost the lives of men who had trusted American promises of protection. The contradiction was not invisible to Hanssen. He was aware of it. He thought about it. He wrote about it in the communications he passed to his Soviet and Russian handlers in ways that suggested a man who had constructed an elaborate internal architecture for containing the contradiction without resolving it. He told himself that he never revealed anything that would lead to a loss of life, even after the evidence that this was false had become, by his own actions, undeniable. Hanssen began his espionage in October 1979, 3 years into his FBI career, when he walked into the offices of the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, in New York City and volunteered his services. He was assigned to a Soviet counterintelligence unit in New York at the time, which gave him access to information about the FBI's monitoring of Soviet intelligence operations in the United States. And what he offered the GRU in that first contact was the identity of a Soviet military officer named Dmitry Polyakov, who had been working as an FBI and CIA source for nearly 2 decades. Polyakov was one of the most valuable human intelligence assets the United States had ever recruited. He had provided extraordinarily detailed information about Soviet military doctrine, weapons programs, and intelligence operations across a span of years that was unprecedented in the history of American counterintelligence recruitment. Hanssen gave him up in his first communication with Soviet intelligence, before he had established any operational relationship, before he had received any money, apparently as a demonstration of good faith and operational value. Polyakov was not immediately arrested. The the Soviets were careful not to roll up an asset in a way that would reveal they had received information about him. But he was eventually arrested in 1986 and executed in 1988, after Hanssen had by then been providing information for nearly a decade, and the Soviets had been able to confirm the intelligence he provided through other sources. Polyakov died because Robert Hanssen gave him up to demonstrate he was worth doing business with. He then suspended his espionage, apparently alarmed by his wife Bonnie's discovery that he had been passing information. She had found evidence of his GRU contact and confronted him, and he had told her he had not passed anything of significance and would stop, and she had, in an act whose consequences are difficult to assess without anger, taken him at his word and gone to her priest rather than to the FBI. The priest counseled prayer and charity. Hanssen stopped his espionage for about 3 years. In 1985, he resumed it, this time not with the GRU, but with the KGB, and this time with a sophistication and a security consciousness that reflected both his professional training and the 3 years he had spent thinking about how to do it without getting caught. He never met his handlers in person. He communicated primarily through dead drops, packages left at predetermined locations and collected by the other party without either side being present when the other was there. He refused to provide his real name. He called himself Ramon Garcia, or B, or simply the source, and he maintained a compartmentalization between his real identity and his operational identity that was more disciplined than anything the KGB had seen from a walk-in volunteer, and that the KGB found both impressive and slightly alarming, because a source who is that careful about protecting his own identity is a source you cannot fully verify, cannot fully trust, and cannot easily manage. They managed him anyway, because what he was providing was worth the management difficulties. They gave him the code name B, later Ramon, and they received from him, over the 15 years of their relationship that followed, a volume and quality of intelligence that their own subsequent assessments described as catastrophic for American national security. The specific intelligence Hanssen provided to the Soviet Union and then to Russia is documented in the damage assessment that the Department of Justice and the intelligence community conducted after his arrest, a document that is itself classified, but whose outlines have been established through court proceedings, subsequent reporting, and official statements. He revealed the existence of the continuity of government program, the highly classified plans for maintaining American government operations in the event of a nuclear war, including the locations of the facilities where the continuity operations would be based. He revealed the existence and technical details of a secret tunnel that the National Security Agency and the FBI had spent hundreds of millions of dollars and years of effort constructing under the Soviet embassy in Washington, a tunnel designed to intercept the communications cables running between the embassy and its facilities, a program whose compromise meant that the Soviets were able to use the embassy for communications they knew were secure, negating an intelligence collection capability of extraordinary value. He passed thousands of pages of classified documents covering a range of counterintelligence programs, revealing the identities of Soviet intelligence officers the FBI had identified and was monitoring, revealing the technical surveillance methods the FBI was using against Soviet targets in the United States, revealing the identities of American intelligence sources and agents in a way that allowed Soviet and Russian intelligence to identify and neutralize them. He passed computer diskettes containing software and programs used by American intelligence agencies in ways that gave Soviet and Russian intelligence insight into the methods and priorities of American signals intelligence collection. He provided assessments of American intelligence on specific topics that allowed Soviet intelligence to understand what the Americans knew and did not know, and to manage their operations accordingly. And he gave up 3 men whose names became the most morally specific part of the damage he caused. Dmitry Polyakov, already mentioned, executed in 1988. Valery Martinov, an officer of the KGB's Washington residency who had been recruited as an FBI and CIA source and who was recalled to Moscow, arrested, tried, and shot in 1987. And Sergei Motorin, another KGB officer recruited as an American source, also recalled, also arrested, also shot. These 3 men had trusted the American intelligence system with their lives. The American intelligence system had failed to protect them because the man running the counterintelligence programs that were supposed to protect them was the man selling them to their executioners. The years between 1985 and 1991 were the most productive of Hanssen's espionage career, in the specific sense that he was passing the most material and receiving the most payment, and apparently experiencing the relationship with Soviet intelligence as the one context in his professional life in which his abilities were fully appreciated. He wrote to his KGB handlers in a way that has no parallel in the documented history of American espionage. Discursively, analytically, sometimes at considerable length, offering his own assessments of American intelligence programs and their weaknesses, making recommendations about how Soviet intelligence could improve its operations in the United States, critiquing what he saw as the KGB's operational deficiencies with the confidence of a man who considered himself the most competent person involved in the arrangement. He told them they were too aggressive in their recruitment approaches. He told them their counterintelligence practices were weak in specific ways. He told them their tradecraft for handling American sources was inferior to what the FBI practiced. He was, in essence, consulting for the organization he was betraying his country to, providing not just intelligence, but professional advice. And the KGB received this advice with the mixture of irritation and respect that a highly capable but difficult client tends to generate. He also communicated an awareness of his own moral situation that suggests a man who had not solved the problem of what he was doing, but had decided to live with it, maintaining the externalities of his religious practice, the daily Mass, the Opus Dei membership, the Sunday school teaching, while constructing an internal argument that allowed him to continue. He told himself, in his communications with his handlers, and presumably in his own interior monologue, that he was not providing information that would harm individuals, that he was providing strategic intelligence, that both sides in the Cold War needed to make informed decisions about their nuclear arsenals, that the mutual deterrence he was contributing to by ensuring that Soviet intelligence had an accurate picture of American capabilities was itself a form of stability. This argument collapsed under the weight of the 3 names of the men he had given up to be shot, and Hanssen knew it collapsed, and he continued anyway. The Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, and Hanssen paused his espionage again, apparently uncertain about the operational landscape of post-Soviet Russia and about whether the relationships he had built with the KGB would survive the institutional transformation of that organization into the FSB and the SVR. He resumed contact with Russian intelligence in 1999, after a gap of nearly 8 years, apparently because he needed money and because the financial rewards of the espionage relationship had become something he relied on in ways that his FBI salary alone could not sustain. By the time he resumed contact, he had been assigned to a sensitive position in the FBI's National Security Division, a position that gave him access to information about counterintelligence programs and methods that Russian intelligence was eager to receive, and he provided it, continuing the relationship for 2 more years until the Russian source, whose file purchase by the CIA would end his career, made the transaction that set in motion his arrest. The FBI's failure to identify Hanssen across 22 years of active espionage is a failure that the subsequent investigations and reviews attributed to a combination of specific institutional pathologies that the Hanssen case did not create, but did expose with unusual clarity. The first and most fundamental pathology was the FBI's institutional culture of trust, specifically the trust that senior agents invested in one another that made the serious investigation of a colleague for espionage feel, within the Bureau's culture, like an act of institutional betrayal more serious than the espionage itself. The FBI had known since the mid-1990s that it had a mole. The executions of Martinov and Motorin, the compromise of the embassy tunnel, the repeated failures of sources and methods that could only be explained by a penetration of the intelligence programs managing them had made the existence of a mole a working hypothesis within the counterintelligence division. The investigation that followed focused, for years, on a CIA officer named Brian Kelly, a man who was not the mole, who was subjected to years of investigation and surveillance and professional humiliation on the basis of circumstantial evidence that seemed to point toward him, and who was cleared only after the Russian source's file purchase provided the fingerprint evidence that pointed toward Hanssen instead. The investigation's focus on Kelly at the expense of the actual mole reflected a set of analytical assumptions that the investigation never adequately questioned, that the mole was more likely to be a CIA officer than an FBI officer, because the CIA's Cold War counterintelligence failures, the Aldrich-Ames case most prominently, had established a cultural narrative within the FBI that the problem was at Langley rather than at the Hoover Building. Ames had been arrested in 1994 and convicted of selling American agents to the Soviets for over 9 years, and his arrest had produced a narrative of CIA institutional failure that made it easier for FBI investigators hunting a mole to look across the river than in their own building. Hanssen benefited from this narrative, and he knew he was benefiting from it. There are indications in the post-arrest record that he was aware the investigation was focused on Kelly, and that he found this both professionally satisfying and personally contemptuous. The contempt of a man who considered himself smarter than the people hunting him, and was being repeatedly confirmed in this assessment. The second institutional pathology the Hanssen case exposed was the FBI's failure to implement the most basic counterintelligence practices with respect to its own personnel, practices that the CIA had developed in response to its own mole problems and that the FBI had not adopted despite repeated recommendations from both internal and external reviewers. The most fundamental of these was the lie detector requirement. The CIA began requiring regular polygraph examinations of its employees as a standard counterintelligence measure in the wake of the Ames case, not because polygraphs are reliable detectors of deception. The scientific consensus on their reliability is distinctly unimpressive, but because the process of regular polygraph examination creates a deterrent and an audit trail that makes the maintenance of a long-term espionage relationship more difficult and more risky. The FBI, as of the time of Hanssen's arrest, did not routinely polygraph its own agents, a practice gap that had been noted by reviewers, but that the Bureau's leadership had resisted changing on the grounds that subjecting FBI agents to regular polygraph examination would be corrosive to the culture of mutual trust that the Bureau regarded as one of its institutional strengths. Hanssen was never polygraphed during his 22 years of espionage. This is not to say that a polygraph examination would necessarily have caught him. The evidence on polygraph effectiveness against practiced deceivers with Hanssen's psychological profile is ambiguous. But the absence of any polygraph requirement meant that the deterrent that the process would have created was entirely absent. The third pathology was the Bureau's failure to systematically audit the access of its agents to classified systems, particularly the electronic databases that Hanssen accessed extensively in the years after his return to contact in 1999. Hanssen routinely accessed databases that were not relevant to his official duties, apparently probing for information about counterintelligence investigations that might have been directed at him. And the access logs that recorded these queries were not systematically reviewed in ways that would have flagged anomalous access patterns. When investigators reviewed the logs after his arrest, the pattern of his anomalous queries was visible and would have been significant if anyone had been looking at it. No one had been. The Bureau had not established the kind of access monitoring and anomaly detection that the volume and sensitivity of its classified holdings required, in part because establishing it would have required the Bureau to treat its own agents as potential security risks rather than as presumptively trustworthy colleagues, and the culture of the institution made that reframing feel, to the people who would have had to authorize it, like a statement about the Bureau's relationship with itself that they were not prepared to make. The personal profile of Robert Hanssen, the devout Catholic, the Sunday school teacher, the Opus Dei member, the FBI agent who wrote memoranda describing the Bureau's security weaknesses that were accurate and were largely ignored, is one that has attracted more psychological analysis than perhaps any other American traitors, partly because the contradiction between his external religious identity and his actual activities is so stark as to demand explanation, and partly because the explanation turns out to be, in its essentials, deeply mundane. Hanssen was a man who needed to feel superior, and who had found a way to feel superior that cost him, in the external reckoning of his life, nothing visible for 22 years. His FBI career was, by the conventional metrics of the institution, mediocre. He was promoted, eventually, to senior positions, but he was not a rising star. He was not regarded by his supervisors as someone destined for leadership. He was regarded as difficult, as arrogant, as someone whose abilities were real, but whose interpersonal shortcomings made him unsuitable for the roles that his intelligence would otherwise have qualified him for. The espionage gave him something his FBI career could not give him: the certainty that he was operating at a level his colleagues could not see and could not reach, that he was in possession of a secret that demonstrated his superiority more completely than any promotion or commendation could have done. He was not betraying his country because he believed in communism. He was, by all accounts, a genuine anti-communist who found the Soviet system morally repugnant. He was not betraying it primarily for money, though the money mattered. He was betraying it for the same reason that the most psychologically complex traitors have always betrayed their institutions, because the betrayal made him feel, in a way that nothing else in his life could, like the person he believed he should have been recognized as being. This is not an unusual psychology. It is the psychology of a specific kind of gifted and wounded person who finds conventional institutional recognition insufficient to the sense of self they carry, and who discovers, at some point, a way to obtain the validation they need from an audience that the people around them cannot see. The tragedy of this psychology, in Hanssen's case, is not primarily the tragedy of the man himself. It is the tragedy of the 3 men who were shot because of it, and the many sources and programs that were compromised because of it. and the institutional failures that allowed it to continue for 22 years without producing the correction that was available at any point in those years to anyone who had been willing to look. The systemic changes that the Hanssen case forced on American counterintelligence were, considered as a set, a catalog of things that should have been obvious before Hanssen made them mandatory. The FBI implemented a mandatory polygraph program for agents with access to sensitive counterintelligence programs, though the program's scope and frequency have been matters of ongoing institutional negotiation rather than the clear and comprehensive requirement that the post-Hanssen reviews recommended. The Bureau implemented electronic access monitoring and anomaly detection for its classified databases, establishing audit processes that the access logs from Hanssen's career demonstrated had been absent. It implemented need-to-know restrictions on database access that required agents to justify their queries against their official duties, closing the specific vulnerability that Hanssen had exploited when he accessed counterintelligence databases to check whether investigations were being directed at him. It reformed the procedures by which mole investigations were conducted, establishing protocols for ensuring that the investigation of a potential penetration was managed by people who were not themselves potential suspects, closing the specific absurdity of the pre-Hanssen arrangement in which Hanssen had at one point been involved in assessing the damage caused by the very penetration he was responsible for. The CIA and the FBI established formal mechanisms for sharing information about mole investigations across agency lines, reducing the institutional tendency to look at the other agency's building, rather than one's own, when anomalous intelligence failures suggested a penetration. These reforms were real. They changed the way American counterintelligence operated. They were adopted in the specific period of institutional self-examination that followed Hanssen's arrest, driven by the specific shame of having failed to catch a mole for 22 years and having caught him finally only because someone from the other side sold the file. The shame was productive. It produced changes that the pre-Hanssen counterintelligence culture had resisted for years on grounds that the Hanssen case demonstrated were insufficient. What the reforms could not change was the fundamental counterintelligence challenge that the Hanssen case illustrated, that a determined, sophisticated, psychologically disciplined insider with access to sensitive programs can cause enormous damage over an extended period without triggering the automated detection systems that are supposed to catch anomalous behavior, because the behavior is not anomalous from inside the system that the insider has spent years learning to navigate, and because the culture of trust that makes institutions function also makes them resistant to the specific kind of suspicion that counterintelligence requires. The Hanssen case did not solve this problem. No counterintelligence program has solved it. The best available approach is a combination of technical controls, behavioral monitoring, regular security reviews, and a cultural willingness to take seriously the possibility that the problem might be internal rather than external. All things that were available before Hanssen and that the institution he worked for chose not to implement, because implementing them required the institution to treat its own people as potential threats, and that felt to the people who would have had to authorize the treatment, like a statement about the institution's relationship with itself that they preferred not to make. Hanssen was arrested on February 18, 2001 at Foxstone Park as he was placing his package under the bridge. The agents who arrested him had been watching him for weeks, since the Russian source's file had been analyzed and the fingerprint on the garbage bag had been matched, and the arrest was timed to catch him in the act, with classified material in his possession, in a way that would make any defense based on misunderstanding or mistake impossible to sustain. He was 56 years old. He had been with the FBI for 25 years. He was days away from retirement, an irony that the investigators who arrested him presumably noted with feelings that were complicated enough to resist easy description. He was charged with espionage and faced the death penalty, but he negotiated a plea agreement that spared his life in exchange for his full cooperation with the damage assessment that the intelligence community needed to conduct. An agreement that reflected both the community's genuine need to understand the full scope of what he had compromised and the government's calculation that a trial would expose classified information in ways that the intelligence community was not willing to accept. He told his debriefers what he had done, and within the limits of what the debriefers could verify, they believed him, though subsequent analysis of his disclosures suggested he had been selective in what he revealed, withholding certain specifics that might have been more damaging to him or to people he wanted to protect, providing a cooperation that was genuine but not comprehensive. He received a sentence of 15 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole and was sent to ADX Florence in Colorado, the federal supermax facility where he was kept in near complete isolation in a cell for 23 hours a day until his death in June 2023 at the age of 79 from natural causes. He did not recant. He did not express remorse in any form that the people who knew his victims found credible or adequate. He maintained in the conversations he had over the years with the FBI agents who continued to debrief him, and with the journalists and academics who were permitted occasional access, the posture of a man who had made a decision that he understood and that he was prepared to live with. He thought about the 3 men he had given up to be killed. He said so. What he thought about them is less clear, because what he said about them was shaped by the audience he was speaking to and the purposes those statements served, and separating the genuine reflection from the performance in a man who had spent 22 years performing innocence for the people closest to him is not a task that retrospective access to his statements makes straightforward. The FBI's institutional response to the Hanssen case was, in the years immediately following his arrest, marked by a genuine, if painful, willingness to examine the failures that his career represented, and the report produced by former FBI Director William Webster's commission in 2002 is one of the more frank official assessments of institutional failure in the history of American law enforcement. The report identified the specific practices and cultural assumptions that had allowed Hanssen to operate without detection, recommended specific changes, and assessed the damage to American national security in terms that were sobering without being fully quantifiable, because the full quantification of the damage would have required disclosing specific programs and sources whose disclosure would itself have caused additional damage. The Bureau implemented most of the technical recommendations of the Webster report. The cultural recommendations, the ones that required the institution to change how it thought about itself and its own people, were implemented more unevenly because cultural change in large institutions follows a different timeline than technical change and is never as complete or as durable as the people who advocate for it hope. The FBI that existed 5 years after Hanssen's arrest was a better counterintelligence organization than the FBI that had failed to catch him, and the FBI that exists today is better still, and the specific vulnerabilities that Hanssen exploited are, in their specific forms, closed. Whether the fundamental vulnerability that Hanssen's case illustrates, the vulnerability of any human institution to a sophisticated insider who understands the institution's blind spots better than the institution does, has been reduced to an acceptable level, is a question that the history of intelligence betrayal suggests cannot be answered confidently in advance of the next case. The next case, whatever form it takes, will have learned from Hanssen's. The institution will have to learn from it again. Valery Martinov was 36 years old when he was recalled to Moscow and arrested. He had a wife and children. He had been providing the FBI and CIA with information about KGB operations in the United States that was described by the people who managed his case as extraordinarily valuable, the kind of detailed, reliable intelligence about adversary intentions and capabilities that human sources rarely provide at that quality, and that strategic and operational decisions depend on. He knew, when he got on the plane to Moscow, what was likely waiting for him. The intelligence he had been providing had been compromised in ways that pointed to a penetration of the American programs handling him, and the penetration had found him. He got on the plane anyway, either because he had been ordered to and could not refuse without immediately confirming his status, or because he had calculated that the alternative of defecting was worse for his family, or because he had retained enough hope that he was wrong about what was waiting for him to make the gamble. He was tried and executed in 1987. Sergei Motorin died the same year. Their families were told nothing useful about what had happened to them, and for years the American intelligence community could not tell them either, because telling them would have required acknowledging the penetration that had cost their husbands and fathers their lives. A penetration the community could not publicly acknowledge because it could not yet identify the source. Robert Hanssen knew these men had died because of him. He knew it while he attended Mass. He knew it while he taught Sunday school. He knew it while he participated in the investigation of the mole whose actions he was responsible for. He organized this knowledge, apparently, as something he had compartmentalized in the way that his handlers had taught him to compartmentalize operational matters, keeping it separate from the life he was presenting to the world, not because he was incapable of moral reasoning, but because the moral reasoning he would have had to do was reasoning he had decided not to do. This is the specific horror of the Hanssen case that no counterintelligence reform can address. Not the institutional failures, which were real and are at least partially correctable, but the human fact that a man who knew he had sent other men to their deaths continued, for 14 more years after those deaths, to attend Mass and teach Sunday school and receive the sacraments of a faith whose central moral teaching his actions comprehensively violated. The faith did not stop him. The institution did not catch him. The men he gave up to be killed were dead, and he was alive, and he continued, and the system continued, and the damage accumulated, and the 22 years passed, and the park in Vienna was waiting, and the bridge was waiting, and the package was waiting, and finally, on a February morning in 2001, so were the people who had come to arrest him.